Hi guys, welcome back to the Brilliancy Point. Today we are going to learn another short story from ISC Class 12 Echoes, which is The Sound Machine by Roald Dahl. As usual, I'll first explain you the entire story and then towards the end we will discuss the central themes and other important points of the story. But this time I am not going to read out the story line by line, but I'll explain you each and every paragraph, each and every line. We'll go paragraph by paragraph so that you are able to understand the story in one flow, right? And I'll make sure that I don't miss out on any important point in the story. So with this, let us begin the story. So Sound Machine is a science fiction story which is written by Roald Dahl, and it revolves around the life of a scientist whose name is Klausner. It basically revolves around one invention by Klausner, by the scientist. But along with being a science fiction story, the story also underlines the importance of environmental conservation. It shows us the need to protect the environment along with scientific development, and it shows us it underlines the message that there is a need to draw a parallel between scientific development and ecological conservation. So the story begins with the description of the setting. So the setting of the story is near the house of Klausner. The entire story revolves around the house of Klausner, and the story begins on a note where Klausner is there in the shed of his backyard. In the backyard of Klausner's house, there is a wooden shed, and the Klausner is working in the shed. He is working on a machine, and the machine has been described as a black box. The machine is 3 feet long, and it looks like a black box, and it looks like a child's coffin, and there are a lot of wires, and there are a lot of connections in that box, and Klausner is working on those connections. He is twiddling the wires, and he is working on his machine. And while he is doing this, he is consoling himself, he is motivating himself by saying that yes, shall I do like this? Oh, is this right? And he's kind of self-motivating himself, and he's working on that machine very desperately and very obsessedly. He is kind of engrossed in that machine. And while the Klausner was engrossed, Dr. Scott, he suddenly walks in, and he says Klausner that he was just passing by, and so he thought to come and meet Klausner. And then he asks Klausner how his throat was, because maybe Klausner might be having some difficulty in his throat, and he must have told Dr. Scott. So Dr. Scott was just asking that if his throat is working properly now. So Klausner says that yes, he's absolutely fine. And then Dr. Scott asks Klausner that what he's doing, what he's working on. So Klausner gives a very irresponsible response. He just says that he's just fooling around, and it's just an idea that he's working on. So Dr. Scott gets a little interested, a little intrigued, and he asks that what idea is he working on, and what is the machine, what is the box that he is working on, which looks like a machine, because the structure of that box, it was very complicated. There were a lot of wires in it, and Dr. Scott was actually very much impressed by the complexity of that box, and he thought that it is something a little frightening also. He mentions that this box looks a little frightening and a little complex. So he was a little impressed and intrigued by that box. So he asks that, no, what is this exactly? Can you tell me? You have made me curious and inquisitive. So Klausner was quite reluctant to answer this, and that is why he gives a response like, no, it's just an idea. And then when Dr. Scott insists Klausner to speak about the machine, speak about the box, then Klausner says that then Klausner starts discussing about his interest in sounds. He says that there are a lot of sounds around us which human ear cannot hear. He says that any sound which has more than 15,000 vibrations per second, Human ear cannot hear those sounds, but other animals like dogs, they can hear, because there is a particular range till which human ear can hear. And then he says that he is very much interested in listening to those sounds which human ears cannot hear. And then he goes on, he says that every second, anytime, anywhere, wherever we are, there are several beings around us. For example, there are flies in the air, we see butterflies and a lot of insects around us, tiny tiny insects, but they also might be making sounds. We cannot hear it, but they might be making some sound which is not audible to us. So he says that every time, wherever we are, there are a lot of sounds around us. In the environment, there are thousands of songs, musics, and sounds going on. And there is eternity of notes. There is infinity of notes, eternity of notes, but we cannot hear it. And he says that he is interested in listening to all those sounds. And therefore, he has invented a machine which is known as the sound machine. And the entire story is about this machine only. So he says that he has invented a machine, but he hasn't got any results yet. But tonight, means that night, he says that he will again make a trial of his machine tonight. And then he says this, and then suddenly Dr. Scott sees the time and he says that it is time for him to go. So he goes. And then Klausner again, he becomes engrossed in his machine. He again starts working on the machine, twiddling the wires and trying to make connections. And he does that. And then after some time, he becomes very excited, and he takes a wooden table out in the lawn, and he also takes his machine out in the lawn for trial. Okay, and he just puts on his earphone and he begins the trial of the machine. So initially he only hears a humming sound of which was coming from the machine itself. And then after some time he hears a shriek, means a screaming sound. And he suddenly gets excited and shocked, and he just gets surprised that where is this screaming sound coming from. And he looks around everywhere, and then he can see only one woman in the next lawn. Okay, in the next lawn he sees Mrs. Saunders, who was his neighbor. And he thinks that obviously this scream wasn't made by this lady, Mrs. Saunders, it was something else. And then he notices that that lady is cutting a rose. He is that lady, she is snipping roses. And then once again a screaming sound comes, and that screaming sound, it comes exactly when that lady snipped the rose. Means most probably that sound came from the rose. And if it came from the rose, it means that Klausner's invention of that sound machine, it was absolutely successful. So he got a little excited, and then he just stood up and he called out Mrs. Saunders. He went to Mrs. Saunders and he asked her to cut one more rose in order to confirm the functioning of his machine, in order to confirm that the sound was coming from the rose. So he asks Mrs. Saunders that, Mrs. Saunders, can you please cut another rose, please? So Mrs. Saunders, obviously she gets a little confused that why is this person asking me to cut a rose. And then, but she agrees and she cuts another rose. And when she does that, he hears the sound again. And this time he again goes to Mrs. Saunders and he says that, Mrs. Saunders, please don't cut any more roses. And then he explains Mrs. Saunders that, Mrs. Saunders, this evening you have cut a basket full of roses. And these roses, they also feel pain. And I heard these roses screaming. When you snipped the rose, I heard them screaming. So you should not cut any more roses, because you might feel that roses don't have a nervous system and they don't feel pain. But what will happen? How will you react if someone cuts off your wrist? You will feel the pain. So in the similar manner, even roses can feel the pain. And I heard their scream. It was different from human scream. It was throatless. It sounded inhumane. But even then, I heard the cry, and I am sure it was cry of the rose. So you don't cut roses. So he told something like that, and Mrs. Saunders was 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 panic stricken, because she was like, what is this person suddenly talking about all these things? She was a little scared, and so she wishes him goodbye, and she goes back to her home. And after Mrs. Saunders goes back to her house, Klausner was still not sure about the working of his machine. Maybe it was because he was working on that machine for a very long period of time, but it wasn't successful. Means he wasn't successful in his previous trial. So maybe because of that, and because of the long hours of hard work and his extreme desperation for the machine, he wasn't able to believe at once that yes, his invention is successful. So he wasn't able to believe it at once, and that is why he wanted some more trials. So what he did, he plugged a daisy, a white daisy. He plugged it up, and he crashed that daisy with his hands. And then in order to check if it was producing some sound, and he did hear some sound. That sound was a little different from the scream that he heard from the roses. It was a little different sound. It was very light and a very thin voice. Again, it was a kind of scream, and he heard that. And after hearing that, he felt that even plants have emotions. Though these screams are different from that of humans, but still they are a kind of expression of emotions. And he also feels that maybe plants don't feel the same emotions as human feels. Maybe they feel some different kind of emotion. Maybe it might be a like we feel emotions like sadness, happiness, pain, surprise. So he gives name. He suggests a few names for emotions of plants. He says that it might be planikment, something like planikment, which is not in human dictionary. So he just gets this feeling that these sounds are out of some emotions of plants, and these emotions are different from that of humans. And this marks the end of the day. And then the next day, Klausner again wakes up very early in the morning, around 6 o'clock, and he goes to a nearby park. He goes to a nearby park, and he goes there to test his machine. What he does is he takes an axe with him, and he takes his sound machine, and he puts on his earphones, and he hits that axe on a very large beech tree. BEECH, a large beech tree which was there in the park. He hits his axe on that beech tree in order to hear the sound. And as soon as he hits the axe on the tree, he hears a very loud growling sound. A very loud growling sound. And after hearing that sound, he gets mentally disturbed. He gets a little disturbed because of mixed emotions, because he was excited also about the success of his invention, but at the same time he was able to relate to the pain of the tree, because the previous day also he heard screams of plants, and today also when the tree made growling sound, he understood that the tree might be undergoing some pain or some emotions. And then he looks at the scar. He looks at the gash made by the axe on the tree, and he puts his hand on that gash, and he says sorry to the tree. He says that, oh, so sorry for hitting you and all these things, which shows that he was kind of emotionally connected by the plants, by the trees. Though initially he was very excited to check the functioning of his invention, but when he actually checks the functioning of his invention, he is able to empathize with the nature, with the plants, because then he hears the scream, the sound of plants for the first time, and he is able to relate, and he feels compassionate for plants. And that is why he feels very mentally disturbed after hearing that growling sound, and he immediately leaves the axe, and he runs to his home to make a call to Dr. Scott. He makes a telephone call to Dr. Scott, and Dr. Scott was still sleeping because it was very early in the morning. And he picks up the call, and he's like, "What happened? Is there any emergency?" because he called in so early morning. So Klausner is like, no, I am fine, but I have shared this thing only with you. So I want you to be here. I have something very important to tell you. So you please come as soon as possible. Dr. Scott agrees, and he says that yeah, he's coming. And meanwhile, the period when Klausner is waiting for Dr. Scott, so he again and again thinks about that growling sound which the tree made. He thinks about how terrible that growling sound was, and he was a little scared while he was thinking about that sound. Maybe he was touched by the sound because till now he was very much obsessed with his invention. But when he actually hears the cry of plants and the growling sound of the tree, he is very much emotionally touched by that sound, and therefore he was feeling a little panic. He was feeling panic stricken and a little scared. And then he suddenly thinks that this was the sound made by just one tree. What happens if he goes with his sound machine into a field of wheat while the mower is moving through the field, while the mower is cutting a lot of around 500 wheat plants at the same time? So what will happen if 500 wheat plants, they are screaming at the same time in 1 second? So he says that after that he won't be able to eat bread. After hearing that sound, he will give up the bread. And then he thinks that what about other vegetables? Even other vegetables are also cut the same way. So they also might be screaming while they are cut. So he can't hear that sound. So he was thinking all these things, and then he also thinks about apples. And then he feels a little relieved because he says that apples, they fall naturally when they are ripe. So he feels a little relieved when it comes to apples. But then thinking about all other plants like wheat and vegetables, he gets more and more panicked. And meanwhile, Dr. Scott, he arrives, and he asks Klausner that what happened. And then Klausner is like, I want you to hear something. I want to show you something. And then he takes Dr. Scott to the park, to that beech tree. And then he asks Dr. Scott to put on the earphones, and he switches on his sound machine, and he takes up the axe, and he's ready to hit the axe once again into the tree. But he was about to hit the axe onto the tree, and suddenly he stops because he again thinks of that terrible sound, and he was unable to hit it at once because of that, because of remembering that sound. So Dr. Scott asks that what happened, why have you stopped? And then Klausner, he once again takes up the courage to once again hit the axe to the tree. So once again he takes a full swing, and he was about to hit the axe to the tree, and suddenly he feels the shaking of the ground. He feels as if the ground beneath his feet, it is shaking. It is shaking as if there is an earthquake. And he feels that, and unconsciously he hits the tree. Okay, he hits the tree and he feels the shaking of the ground, and the branch of the tree, it suddenly falls, and that entire tree is fallen down, and it falls on the sound machine, and that sound machine is destroyed. And Dr. Scott, who was having his earphones on, he suddenly pulls out his earphone and he runs away for life because the tree might have fallen on Dr. Scott. So he was a little panic stricken and scared, and the entire sound machine was destroyed. So Klausner was moved. He was spellbound. He was standing flabbergasted that what has happened, because it was so much of hard work and efforts, hours and hours of obsession of Klausner was invested into that sound machine, and it was destroyed in front of his eyes. So he was standing flabbergasted, and then he asks Dr. Scott that, Dr. Scott, did you hear anything? And Dr. Scott, he was entirely into a different world because He ran for his life. The tree was about to fall on him. So he was like, no, I couldn't hear anything. And then um, Klausner was insisting that, what exactly did you hear? Did you hear anything? So so Dr. Scott was like, no, I am not sure what I heard because I didn't have my earphones on for more than a second. Okay, because as soon as he put on the earphones and as soon as Klausner hit the tree bark, the branches fell and it was all a chaotic situation and a different situation. So he couldn't hear anything. And then again, Klausner insists once and twice or thrice more that, did you hear anything? Did you hear anything? And then Dr. Scott says that, no, I didn't hear anything because I was more interested in saving my life. Right? I was more interested in saving my life. So I couldn't hear anything. Please don't ask this question. And then Klausner, he stands still and silent for a while. And then he looks at the gash made by the X on the tree. He again moves towards the empathetic part. He again becomes compassionate towards the plants because he thinks that now his invention, his hard work, all is gone. But and at that moment when his hard work is actually proven to be in vain, when his machine is destroyed in front of his eyes, then he feels uh, very empathetic towards the nature, towards the tree, and he sees the gash on the tree, and he asks Dr. Scott to stitch up the tree. He's like, Dr. Scott, stitch up this gash. And then Dr. Scott says that, I cannot stitch through woods. And then Klausner again says that, no, you stitch it up. And then Dr. Scott says that, no, it is not possible. You are talking silly. Don't be silly. And then Klausner asks that, do you have iodine in your bag? If you have iodine, apply iodine on this gash. And then doctor again says that, don't be ridiculous. And then Klausner says that, paint the cut with iodine. He says it with in quite a scary tone. Okay, so Dr. Scott, he agrees and he takes out the iodine bottle and he applies iodine on the gash. And Klausner says that, not just today, you have to look after this tree until it is fine. You have to come tomorrow also and keep a check on this tree. You have to cure this tree. And on this note, the story ends. Okay, Klausner asks Dr. Scott to apply iodine on the gash, and doctor does that, and then both of them, they return to the home, and this is the end of the story. So this is a very, very interesting story. And as I told in the beginning also, that the main theme of the story is drawing, is the message that we must draw a line, a parallel between scientific advancement and environmental conservation. Means we cannot achieve, and we should not aim to achieve, scientific advancement at the cost of environment, because ultimately environment is more powerful over human mind. Environment has a lot more power than human mind has, than the power of science. Okay, as in this story also, no matter how much hard work Klausner had put in, how much mindful and how much rational he was, but even then, ultimately nature won over science. Okay, and in the conflict between nature and human, nature always wins, because nature is the mother of everything, and nothing is above and beyond nature. So there is a conflict between nature and humans in this story, and in this conflict, nature proves to be more powerful. Okay, then another important point about the story is, another thing to notice in the story is the character sketch of Klausner. It is very, very important. So when we talk about the character sketch of Klausner, then we can say that Klausner is a very desperate, very dedicated, very hardworking, and quite uh, an insane. No, we cannot say insane, but he is a very obsessed person. He is very much obsessed with science. He is very much obsessed with invention, his invention, and he is very curious. He is very curious to listen to new sounds. And secondly, we can also say that Klausner, despite his obsession with science, he is also a man of senses. He is also a man of sanity. Though initially, in the initial phase of the story, he was prioritizing his self-interest, his invention over the lives of plant. He was ready to kill plants. He was ready to pluck flowers and kill plants for the sake of his invention, for the sake of success of his invention. But ultimately, he turns out to be a savior of nature. In the end, as we see, he doesn't care about the devastation of his machine. He doesn't whine over the devastation of his machine, but he rather thinks about the about curing the plant, about curing the tree. So we can say that despite all his obsession, despite all his scientific mindedness and curiosity, he still was a man of senses. He was sensible enough, he was sane enough to understand the plant life, and he was able to understand that environment is over and above everything, and that is why he turns out to be a savior of nature in the end. So this is a kind of a positive aspect of Klausner's character, that he was sensible enough, and despite all his obsession, he was still careful towards nature, empathetic towards nature. He was concerned towards nature, because when he asks Mrs. Saunders to cut another rose and she does, so that is okay. But after that, when he approaches Mrs. Saunders and he explains her the pain of plants, and he explains about plant life, so at that point of time also we can feel that we get this impression that Klausner was a man who was thoughtful and who was concerned about nature. So these were two very important things. And next important thing is the physical description of Klausner, which is given in the story, that Klausner was a frail man. He was frail, nervous, and twitchy, and he had a smooth and pale face with gray eyes, and his head was inclined towards his left shoulder, which showed that his neck is not very stable. And all this physical description is given about Klausner. So go through that also. And I hope you understood this story very well. And if you really liked this explanation, please like and comment my video. And don't forget to press the bell icon. Thank you. See you in next video.